Imagine you have some extra money. You want to keep it somewhere incredibly safe, a place where it will not only be protected, but also, grow a little bit. For decades, the entire world, from giant countries like China and Japan to big investment banks, and even your own grandparents' retirement fund, has had the same idea. They put their money in something called United States Treasury bonds. Think of these bonds as the world's most trusted piggy bank. When you buy a bond, you're essentially lending money to the US government. In return, the government promises to pay you back in full, with a little extra interest on top. It's like an IOU from Uncle Sam himself. The reason everyone trusted these bonds is simple. The US government has never ever failed to pay its debts, not once. This perfect track record made US bonds the ultimate safe haven asset. Whenever there was a crisis somewhere else in the world, a war, a financial crash, a natural disaster, investors would panic and rush to buy US bonds. It was a predictable pattern. The world might be on fire, but everyone assumed Uncle Sam's piggy bank was fireproof. This global trust was more than just a nice reputation, it was a superpower. It allowed the United States to borrow huge amounts of money at very low costs, funding everything from its military to its highways. This system worked beautifully for a very long time, creating a stable foundation for the entire global financial system. Countries held US bonds as their emergency savings. Banks used them as a secure asset to back up their operations. The US dollar, which is what these bonds are bought and sold in, became the world's main currency for trade. Everything was interconnected, with US Treasury bonds acting as the central, unshakable pillar holding it all up. People didn't just think paying impost bonds was safe. They believed it was a fundamental law of finance like gravity. But as we would soon learn, even the strongest pillars can develop cracks under enough pressure. Confidence was so deep that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because everyone believed US bonds were safe, everyone wanted them, which in turn made them even safer and more stable. It was a virtuous cycle built on decades of political stability, economic strength, and the simple, unwavering promise to always pay back what was owed. This bedrock of trust allowed the global economy to function with the US at its very center. The idea that investors might one day flee from US bonds during a crisis instead of to them was not just unlikely, it was considered completely absurd. A fantasy scenario cooked up in the most pessimistic economic textbooks. That is, until it wasn't. So, what could possibly shake this mountain of trust? The answer arrived in the form of something that sounds boring but is actually financial dynamite: tariffs. A tariff is simply a tax that a country puts on goods it imports from another country. For example, if the US puts a tariff on steel from China, any American company buying that steel has to pay an extra tax, making the Chinese steel more expensive. The idea, in theory, is to encourage people to buy American-made steel instead, protecting local jobs. It sounds simple enough, but when used aggressively, it's like throwing a rock into a very complicated and delicate machine. Under President Donald Trump, the use of tariffs went from being a specific tool to full-blown strategy. This wasn't just a tax on steel here or a fee on washing machines there. This was a tariff storm. The administration imposed sweeping tariffs on goods from all over the world, most notably China, but also on traditional allies like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. The goal was to rewrite global trade rules in America's favor. But other countries didn't just sit back and take it. They fought back with their own tariffs on American goods, like soybeans, motorcycles, and whiskey. This back and forth retaliation is what we call a trade war. A trade war is not like a conventional war with soldiers and tanks. It's a war fought with taxes and economic pain. Suddenly, the complex global supply chains that companies had spent decades building were thrown into chaos. A car that was assembled in Ohio might use parts from Mexico, Canada, and Japan. With new tariffs, the cost of making that car skyrocketed. Companies faced a terrible choice: either absorb the extra costs and make less profit, or pass the costs on to consumers by raising prices. This uncertainty made businesses everywhere nervous. They stopped hiring new people and cancelled plans to build new factories, causing a slowdown in the global economy. The tariff storm was more than just an economic policy. It was a seismic shift in how America dealt with the world. For generations, the US had been the champion of free trade, encouraging countries to lower their barriers and trade openly with one another. Now, the very country that built the system was taking a sledgehammer to it. This sent a powerful message to the rest of the world: the old rules no longer applied. The predictable, stable global order, with America as its reliable anchor, was being replaced by something chaotic, unpredictable, and confrontational. And this growing chaos would soon begin to chip away at the world's faith in America's most sacred promise. For the first time in modern history, a global crisis started, and investors did the unthinkable. They started selling US Treasury bonds. This was the financial equivalent of discovering that the law of gravity had suddenly been suspended. In every previous crisis, the flight to safety was a reflex, but this time was different. The crisis wasn't happening somewhere else. It was being caused by the United States itself. The tariff storm and the ensuing trade war was seen as self-inflicted wounds, orchestrated by the very government whose bonds were supposed to be the ultimate shelter. Investors began to ask a terrifying question: why would you hide from a storm inside the lighthouse that is causing the storm? As this fear took hold, a slow but steady sell-off began. Major foreign holders of US debt, like China and Japan, who were also targets in the trade war, started to quietly reduce their holdings. They weren't just diversifying their savings. They were sending a political message. Why should they continue to finance the government of a country that was actively harming their economy? This selling put downward pressure on the price of US bonds. As bond prices fall, their yields, the return an investor gets, go up. Higher yields mean it becomes more expensive for the US government to borrow money, putting immense strain on its finances. The problem quickly snowballed. As other investors around the world saw the big players selling, they panicked and followed suit. The belief that US bonds were unshakable was itself the main thing that made them unshakable. Once that belief was broken, the magic was gone. The world's safest piggy bank was suddenly seen as cracked. Stock markets around the world plunged. Not just because of the trade war's economic damage, but because the fundamental safety net of the financial system had disappeared. The panic was no longer just about tariffs. It was about the loss of the world's financial anchor. This moment marked a profound psychological break. The trust that had been built over nearly a century evaporated in a matter of months. What made it so much worse was that the traditional tools to fix a crisis were now part of the problem. Normally, the US government and its central bank, the Federal Reserve, would step in to calm markets. But now, the government's own policies were the source of the instability. The world watched in horror as the bedrock of global finance crumbled. Realizing that the one asset everyone had counted on as being risk-free was, in fact, not free of risk at all. The sudden distrust in United States bonds wasn't caused by just one thing. It was a perfect storm of several powerful doubts colliding at once. First and foremost was the ballooning United States national debt. For years, the government had been spending much more than it was collecting in taxes, running up a colossal tab. The situation was made worse by large tax cuts that were not matched by spending reductions. While the United States economy was still huge, investors began to worry if the debt was becoming too big to ever be paid back. Moody's, a major ratings agency, even downgraded its outlook on United States government debt, which was a clear warning sign that the world's top experts were getting nervous about America's financial discipline. Second, there was escalating political chaos within the United States. The deep divisions between political parties led to constant fights over the budget and the debt ceiling, the legal limit on how much money the government can borrow. In the past, raising this limit was a routine procedure, but it had become a tool for political brinkmanship, with threats of a government shutdown or, even worse, a default on the national debt. For global investors who prize stability above all else, watching the world's leading superpower bicker over whether to pay its bills was deeply unsettling. The political paralysis made the United States look less like a stable global leader and more like an unreliable risk. Third, serious questions arose about the independence of the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. The Fed's job is to manage the economy by setting interest rates, and it's supposed to do so without political interference. However, there was increasing public pressure from the White House for the Fed to keep interest rates low to help the economy and make government borrowing cheaper. This created a fear of fiscal dominance, where the central bank stops fighting inflation and instead just prints money to finance government debt. If the Fed lost its independence, investors worried it would lead to runaway inflation, which would destroy the value of their bond holdings. Finally, the behavior of foreign creditors sealed the deal. Countries like China, which held trillions of dollars in United States bonds, were directly in the crosshairs of the trade war. They logically began to reduce their exposure to United States debt, seeking safer, more diversified investments. When the biggest customers of a product start walking away, everyone else notices. This combination of staggering debt, political instability, a potentially compromised central bank, and spooked foreign investors created a toxic cocktail of doubt. The world's safest piggy bank no longer looked so safe. Not because of an outside threat, but because of problems brewing inside. When United States bonds, the bedrock of the global financial system, began to crumble, the shock waves were felt in every corner of the world. The first and hardest hit were emerging markets, the poorer and developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These nations often borrow money in United States dollars to fund their development. When the value of United States bonds fell, United States interest rates shot up, making it dramatically more expensive for these countries to pay back their loans. At the same time, panicked investors pulled their money out of these risky markets to hoard cash, causing local currencies to collapse. This created a vicious cycle of debt and currency depreciation, pushing many nations to the brink of default. The crisis wasn't contained to developing nations. Financial markets in wealthy countries like Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom also went into a nosedive. Global stock markets crashed as the confidence that held them up evaporated. But the bigger problem was in the credit markets, where businesses and banks lend to each other. These markets, which are the lifeblood of the economy, froze solid. Banks, suddenly terrified about the value of their own assets and unsure who was safe to lend to, simply stopped lending. This credit crunch meant that even healthy companies couldn't get the short-term loans they needed to pay their employees and suppliers, threatening to grind the entire global economy to a halt. For ordinary people, the effects were stark and immediate. The value of retirement and pension funds, which were heavily invested in what were thought to be safe bonds and stocks, plummeted. The rising uncertainty and economic slowdown led to widespread layoffs as companies struggled to cope with frozen credit and disrupted supply chains. What started as a high-level dispute over trade policy had trickled down to threaten the jobs, savings, and livelihoods of millions of people around the globe. The interconnectedness that had once been a source of global prosperity had now become a conduit for spreading financial contagion at lightning speed. The crisis exposed just how dependent the world had become on the stability of the United States. For decades, the global system had operated on the assumption that America would always be the reliable, stabilizing force. The tariff storm and the subsequent bond crisis shattered that assumption. The world was now adrift in a sea of uncertainty without its traditional anchor. Every country, every bank, and every investor was forced to confront a new and terrifying reality. The center of the global financial system was no longer holding, and no one knew what would replace it. The world had caught a very, very nasty cold. In a normal financial crisis, the world's central banks and governments act like a team of firefighters. They coordinate their actions, slash interest rates, and pump money into the system to restore confidence and get credit flowing again. This playbook had worked during previous meltdowns. But this time, the fire department was in disarray. The main problem was that the usual chief firefighter, the United States, was the one who had started the fire. The very policies that needed to be reversed, the tariffs and the confrontational trade stance, were the centerpiece of the administration's agenda, making a coordinated global response nearly impossible. Central banks around the world, including the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan, did what they could. They cut interest rates and launched emergency lending programs. However, these tools were less effective this time. The problem wasn't just a lack of money in the system. It was a fundamental breakdown of trust. Lowering interest rates doesn't help if banks are too scared to lend and businesses are too scared to borrow. It was like trying to put out a house fire with a garden hose while someone else was still inside pouring gasoline on the flames. The usual monetary policy tools were simply not powerful enough to overcome a crisis of pure confidence. International institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank tried to step in to help, especially in the struggling emerging markets. They offered emergency loans to countries on the verge of default. But the scale of the crisis was overwhelming and their resources were stretched thin. Furthermore, the geopolitical fragmentation caused by the trade war made it difficult to get major powers like the United States and China to agree on a unified plan of action. The spirit of international cooperation that was essential to fighting a global crisis had been badly damaged, replaced by suspicion and national self-interest. Ultimately, the response was piecemeal and insufficient. Without the United States leading a credible, coordinated global effort to restore trust, the measures taken by individual countries and institutions were only temporary patches on a massive structural problem. The crisis revealed a terrifying weakness in the global financial architecture. It had no effective plan B for a situation where its most important member became the primary source of instability. The firefighters had arrived, but their leadership was compromised and their equipment was inadequate for a blaze of this magnitude. The world was largely left to watch it burn. After the dust from the great tariff storm crisis began to settle, the world was left to survey the damage and, more importantly, to learn from it. The most profound lesson was a simple but painful one. No asset is truly 100% risk-free. The belief in the absolute safety of United States Treasury bonds had been a cornerstone of global finance for generations. Its collapse forced every investor, central bank, and government to fundamentally reevaluate how they thought about risk. The crisis showed that political decisions and domestic instability within a country could be just as dangerous to its financial credibility as a poor economy. Trust, once lost, is incredibly difficult to regain. This painful lesson sparked a global push toward diversification. Countries realized it was dangerous to keep all their eggs in one basket, especially if that basket was the United States dollar. Central banks began to slowly but surely shift their foreign reserves into other currencies, like the euro and the Chinese yuan, and into other assets like gold. While no single currency could immediately replace the dollar's dominant role, this marked the beginning of a gradual shift toward a more multipolar financial system. One where several currencies and countries share the burden of global stability. The world was actively trying to build a system that was less dependent on the actions of any single nation. Governments and international institutions also began to rethink the rules of the global financial system. There were urgent calls for reforms at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to give them more resources and power to act decisively in future crises. New discussions began about creating better mechanisms for international policy coordination so that the world would not be caught flat-footed again. The crisis served as a brutal wake-up call, highlighting the need for a stronger global safety net and clearer rules of the road to prevent destructive trade wars and the political turmoil that fueled them. Ultimately, the tariff storm crisis of 2025 was a story about the fragility of trust. It showed how quickly decades of financial stability could be undone by confrontational policies and a breakdown in global cooperation. The world learned that economic strength is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about predictability, reliability, and faith in institutions. In the aftermath, countries began the long and difficult process of rebuilding that trust, not just in America, but in the idea of a shared, stable, global system. The goal was clear: to build a world economy that was more resilient, more balanced, and hopefully less likely to ever again place its entire faith in a single, supposedly unbreakable piggy bank.